At my granddaughter's wedding, I noticed my name tag said, "The old lady who's paying for everything." I read the words twice because my mind refused to accept them the first time. The young woman at the reception table smiled politely, as if she had just handed me something perfectly normal, while around us guests laughed beneath crystal chandeliers, and waiters carried silver trays filled with champagne flutes. For a moment, I simply stood there holding that cream-colored card between my fingers, staring at the elegant gold lettering that reduced 71 years of love, sacrifice, and loyalty into a cruel little joke. I felt my chest tighten, but I smiled anyway. That was the thing about women my age. We learned how to survive humiliation quietly. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" the receptionist asked softly. I nodded and slipped the card into the silver holder attached to my dress. "Of course," I said. "It's a lovely wedding." My voice sounded calm, even warm. No one would have guessed my heart was cracking open beneath the pale blue silk gown I had spent 2 weeks choosing for this day. Sophie had always loved blue when she was little. She used to say it made me look like Grace Kelly. The ballroom at the Grand Preston Hotel looked like something out of a bridal magazine. White roses overflowed from tall crystal vases. Golden candlelight reflected across polished marble floors. A string quartet played softly near the dance floor while guests admired the 6-tier wedding cake standing beneath an arch of fresh orchids flown in from California. I paid for all of it. The orchids alone had cost nearly $4,000. Not that anyone seemed to remember that tonight. I spotted my son Ryan near the bar adjusting the cuffs of his tuxedo while his wife Melissa laughed beside him, one manicured hand resting possessively against his arm. Melissa looked beautiful, I'll give her that. Tall, blonde, polished. She had the kind of smile that made strangers trust her instantly. For years, I tried to convince myself she loved our family. But standing there with that humiliating name tag pinned against my chest, I suddenly remembered dozens of moments I had ignored. The forgotten phone calls. The holiday dinners I somehow wasn't invited to until the last minute. The subtle little comments disguised as jokes. "You know Evelyn loves paying for things. That generation doesn't know what to do with money anyway. You're basically the family sponsor." I used to laugh along because I thought keeping the peace was more important than protecting my pride. I understand now how dangerous that kind of thinking can become. "Grandma." Sophie rushed toward me then, glowing in her ivory wedding gown, her veil trailing behind her like soft clouds. For one brief second, the pain eased. She wrapped her arms around me carefully so she wouldn't wrinkle her dress. "You made it," she said breathlessly. "You look beautiful." I touched her cheek gently. "So do you, sweetheart." And I meant it. Sophie truly looked radiant. Her eyes sparkled with excitement and nerves and happiness. Looking at her, I wanted desperately to believe the name tag was just some tasteless mistake. But then Melissa appeared beside us holding a champagne glass. "There you are," she said brightly. "Ryan and I were wondering if you saw your little table card joke." My stomach dropped. She knew. Of course she knew. Sophie gave a confused little laugh. "What joke?" Melissa smiled wider. "Oh, just something funny for family. Your grandmother's basically the reason this wedding could happen." She winked as though we were all sharing something harmless and clever. Ryan finally looked at me then, and instead of embarrassment, I saw something worse in his expression. Avoidance. He knew too. My own son knew they'd humiliated me publicly, and he'd allowed it because confronting Melissa would have been uncomfortable. I folded my hands neatly in front of me so no one would notice they were trembling. "Well," I said softly, "I suppose every wedding needs entertainment." Melissa laughed. Sophie looked uncertain now, glancing between us as if she sensed something unpleasant moving beneath the surface. But the music kept playing. Guests kept smiling. Glasses kept clinking. No one stops a celebration just because an old woman's heart gets bruised. I excused myself and walked slowly toward my table near the edge of the ballroom. As I sat down, I noticed another guest staring at my name tag before quickly looking away in discomfort. That was the moment I realized something painful. The humiliation wasn't private. Everyone had seen it. They had turned me into a joke in a room full of 200 people, and somehow they expected me to smile through it because I was family. I reached for my water glass carefully. Across the ballroom, Melissa threw her head back laughing at something one of her friends said. Ryan stood beside her silently, as always. And for the very first time in my life, I allowed myself to wonder whether my family loved me at all, or whether they simply loved what I could give them. I remained at that corner table for most of the evening, quietly watching people celebrate a wedding I had practically built with my own savings account. Every crystal glass, every embroidered napkin, every arrangement of white roses sitting beneath the warm ballroom lights existed because I had written check after check over the last 14 months. Melissa had called me constantly while planning the wedding, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day. She wanted imported flowers from Oregon, a live jazz band during cocktail hour, handmade wedding favors wrapped in silk ribbon, a custom ice sculpture shaped like intertwined swans. Every time I hesitated, she would lower her voice and say, "This is Sophie's special day, Evelyn. We only get one chance to make it perfect." And every single time, I gave in because Sophie was the closest thing I had to pure joy left in this world after my husband died. I remembered sitting at my kitchen table last winter while snow covered the backyard, listening to Sophie excitedly describe the ceremony over the phone. "I want it to feel timeless, Grandma," she had said. "Elegant, like those old Hollywood weddings you love." I smiled at the memory while staring down at my untouched slice of wedding cake. The frosting looked beautiful, pale ivory buttercream with delicate sugar flowers pressed along the edges. I could not bring myself to eat it. Around me, conversations floated through the ballroom in soft waves. People complimented the venue, the decorations, the champagne selection. One woman near the dance floor whispered loudly enough for me to hear, "This wedding must have cost a fortune." Her husband chuckled and replied, "Well, apparently Grandma is paying for all of it." They both laughed lightly, not cruelly exactly, but carelessly. That was the thing I was beginning to understand. Cruelty did not always arrive screaming. Sometimes it wore a tuxedo and smiled politely while humiliating you in public. Sophie and her new husband began their first dance beneath soft golden lights while guests gathered around clapping gently. She looked so happy that my eyes stung for a moment. I forced myself to focus on her smile instead of the heaviness sitting in my chest. For a few seconds, I almost convinced myself none of the rest mattered. Then Melissa approached my table again, carrying another glass of champagne. "Why are you sitting all alone?" she asked with exaggerated concern. "People probably think you are upset." I looked up at her calmly. Should I not be? Her smile tightened almost invisibly. "Oh, Evelyn, it was just a joke. Everyone knows how generous you are." Generous. Such a pretty word for being used. "I suppose humor changes with every generation," I replied quietly. Melissa laughed softly, but there was irritation beneath it now. "You always take things too personally." Before I could answer, Ryan appeared beside her. He loosened his bow tie slightly and glanced around the ballroom instead of looking directly at me. "Mom, did you see the seafood tower? Melissa did an amazing job planning everything." I stared at my son for several long seconds. When he was 8 years old, he used to run into my room during thunderstorms because he thought I could protect him from anything. I worked double shifts for years so he could attend a private college after his father's construction business struggled during the recession. I helped pay for his first apartment, his first car, even the down payment on the house he now shared with Melissa in Connecticut. Yet somehow standing there in that ballroom, he looked at me less like a mother and more like an obligation he hoped would not create a scene. "It is beautiful," I finally said. Ryan nodded with visible relief. That relief hurt more than the name tag itself. It meant he had expected pain from me tonight, and simply hoped I would keep it quiet enough not to inconvenience anyone. After they walked away, I reached into my purse and pulled out the folded receipt portfolio Melissa had handed me 2 weeks earlier. Final vendor payments, additional floral upgrades, last-minute guest accommodations at the hotel. Nearly $12,000 beyond the original budget. I had paid it without argument because Sophie sounded stressed during our last phone call. Looking back now, I realized no one had even asked whether I was comfortable spending that much. They had simply assumed I would. A waiter passed carrying silver trays filled with tiny lobster rolls and champagne flutes. Music drifted softly through the ballroom while couples laughed beneath glowing chandeliers. Everything sparkled. Everything looked perfect. But sitting there alone at the edge of the celebration, I finally understood something I should have recognized years ago. I was not seated at the center of this family because I was loved. I was kept nearby because I was useful. The rest of the evening unfolded like a performance I had already memorized years ago without realizing it. Melissa floated from table to table accepting compliments as though she alone had created the entire wedding with her own hands. Ryan followed closely behind her carrying drinks, laughing at the right moments, nodding whenever she spoke. Watching them together felt strangely familiar, and somewhere between the speeches and the dancing, old memories began surfacing one after another like pieces of broken glass rising through dark water. I remembered the Christmas dinner 3 years earlier when Melissa insisted they celebrate at a ski resort in Vermont instead of at my home like we always had. She told me the mountain air would be too difficult for someone my age, even though I had been healthier than half the guests attending. Later, I saw photographs online of the entire family sitting beside a roaring fireplace, wearing matching pajamas while I ate reheated soup alone in my kitchen. Ryan apologized afterward. He always apologized afterward. Melissa thought you would not enjoy the travel, he had said while refusing to meet my eyes. Then there was Sophie's college graduation. Melissa accidentally gave me the wrong ceremony time, and by the time I arrived, families were already taking photographs outside beneath the university banners. I still remember standing near the parking lot clutching a bouquet of white lilies while strangers hurried past me in celebration. Sophie looked genuinely surprised when she saw me. "Mom said you could not make it," she told me. Melissa immediately stepped in with one of her polished smiles. Oh goodness, was there confusion with the schedule? At the time, I convinced myself it had been an honest mistake because the alternative hurt too much to consider. Sitting in that ballroom now, I realized there had always been a pattern. Tiny humiliations, small exclusions, little cuts carefully disguised as misunderstandings. Melissa never pushed me out loudly. She did it slowly, gracefully, in ways that made me question my own instincts every single time. A soft piano melody drifted through the ballroom while guests gathered near the dessert table. I watched Sophie laughing with her bridesmaids and wondered how much she truly understood. She had been only 19 when Melissa started taking over every family holiday and birthday. Children notice more than adults realize, but they also adapt quickly to whatever atmosphere surrounds them. Over time, Sophie stopped calling me every Sunday like she used to. Then the visits became shorter. Then holidays started feeling formal, almost scheduled. I blamed distance. College. Growing up, I never once allowed myself to admit someone might be carefully pulling us apart. "Mind if I sit?" a gentle voice asked beside me. I looked up to see Grace Whitmore lowering herself carefully into the empty chair next to mine. Grace had been my closest friend for nearly 30 years. Elegant, even at 74, with silver hair swept neatly into a low chignon and pearl earrings that once belonged to her mother. She glanced briefly at my name tag before looking away. With visible discomfort, I almost marched over to that reception table myself, she murmured quietly. I gave a faint smile. That would have caused a scene. Perhaps a scene was deserved. Her voice carried more sharpness than mine ever could anymore. For a moment, we sat together silently watching the dance floor. "Do you remember your anniversary party at the country club?" Grace asked suddenly. 5 years ago, I nodded slowly. Melissa had spent that entire evening making jokes about how expensive the event was while repeatedly telling guests that Ryan and Sophie would someday inherit the Carter fortune. At the time, everyone laughed politely, including me. Grace leaned closer now, lowering her voice. "Evelyn, I have watched that woman chip away at your dignity for years." I stared down at my folded napkin. Maybe I made it easy. Grace shook her head immediately. "No, you loved your family. There is a difference." Her words settled heavily inside me because deep down I knew she was right. Love had made me generous. Love had made me patient. But love had also made me blind. Across the ballroom, Melissa suddenly raised her champagne glass toward me with a bright performative smile, as though we shared some private joke together. Guests nearby laughed warmly around her. Ryan rested one hand against her back while scanning the room distractedly. And in that moment, something inside me shifted quietly into place. Not anger exactly. Anger burns hot and fast. This felt colder, clearer, like finally stepping into daylight after years spent convincing yourself the shadows were normal. The wedding reception slowly softened into that dreamy late evening atmosphere expensive parties always seem to reach after enough champagne has been poured. The older guests settled into quiet conversations while younger couples crowded the dance floor beneath dimmed golden lights. Outside the ballroom windows, the Chicago skyline shimmered against the dark lake like scattered diamonds. I sat quietly beside Grace, watching strangers celebrate around me while memories of my husband kept returning in fragments sharp enough to ache. Thomas would have hated tonight, not the wedding itself. He loved Sophie dearly, but he would have recognized the disrespect immediately. My husband had many flaws during our 43 years of marriage, but blindness was never one of them. He used to notice everything. The slight change in someone's tone, a forced smile, a hidden resentment sitting beneath polite conversation. People reveal themselves in tiny moments, Evelyn. He once told me while we sat on our back porch during a summer thunderstorm years ago. Most of us just do not want to see it. Back then I laughed and accused him of being too suspicious. Now I wondered if he had spent years quietly seeing things I refused to acknowledge. I still remembered the afternoon Melissa first came to our house nearly 18 years ago. Ryan had been nervous introducing her to us. She arrived wearing a cream sweater and carrying a homemade peach pie she claimed she baked herself. Thomas thanked her politely later in the kitchen while she stepped outside to take a phone call. The moment the door closed behind her, he looked down at the perfectly shaped pie crust and said quietly, "Bakery." I laughed at him then. "You cannot possibly know that." He pointed at the identical decorative edge he had seen every Sunday at a local bakery downtown. "That girl wants to impress people very badly," he said. "There is nothing wrong with ambition, but be careful around people who perform kindness too perfectly." I defended her immediately. Melissa was charming, helpful, always eager to compliment everyone in the room. When Thomas passed away 6 years ago after his second heart attack, Melissa cried dramatically at the funeral and told everyone she had lost a father. At the time, her tears moved me deeply. Looking back now, I realized something unsettling. After the funeral, she became even more involved in our finances and family decisions. She insisted on helping organize paperwork. She offered to assist with investments because she claimed Ryan was too busy with work. She started suggesting upgrades to my house before I had even finished grieving. "You should renovate the kitchen, Evelyn. It will increase the property value. You should let Ryan manage your accounts. It is safer. You do not need such a large home at your age." At first those comments sounded practical, caring even. But sitting there beneath the wedding chandeliers, I suddenly heard them differently. Every suggestion had quietly moved me one step closer to dependence, while giving Ryan and Melissa more control over my life. Grace touched my arm gently, pulling me from my thoughts. "Someone is approaching," she murmured. I looked up to see Arthur Bennett walking carefully through the ballroom crowd toward our table. Arthur had been Thomas's attorney and closest friend for nearly 30 years. Even now at 76, he carried himself with the calm confidence of a man who spent his entire life reading uncomfortable truths hidden beneath polished appearances. His charcoal suit looked immaculate despite the late hour. "Evelyn," he said warmly as he reached us. "You look lovely tonight." "Thank you, Arthur." He pulled out the empty chair beside me and sat down slowly. For a few moments, he simply observed the ballroom in silence. Then his eyes lowered briefly toward the name tag pinned against my dress. His expression darkened almost imperceptibly. "Thomas would not have tolerated that," he said quietly. Hearing my husband's name spoken aloud tonight nearly unraveled me. I lowered my gaze to my folded hands. "No," I admitted softly. "He would not." Arthur nodded once as though confirming something privately to himself. Then he leaned slightly closer. "There is something I have been meaning to discuss with you for quite some time, Evelyn." His tone shifted subtly, more serious now. "But after what I witnessed tonight, I believe the conversation can no longer wait." A strange chill moved through me despite the warmth of the ballroom. Across the room, Melissa laughed loudly beside the wedding cake, while Ryan stood near her checking his phone distractedly. Sophie danced happily beneath soft amber lights, completely unaware of the tension quietly tightening around our table. Arthur reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and rested one hand against a sealed cream envelope. "Before he died," he said carefully, "Thomas made certain decisions regarding your family's future. Decisions he instructed me not to discuss unless specific circumstances arose." My heartbeat slowed strangely, like the calm before a storm. Arthur looked directly into my eyes then, steady and unreadable. "And tonight, Evelyn," he said softly, "I believe those circumstances have finally arrived." Arthur did not hand me the envelope immediately. Instead, he rested one hand over it while watching the ballroom quietly, almost as if he wanted me to absorb the full weight of the moment before opening a door that could never be closed again. Around us, the reception continued with effortless elegance. The jazz band had replaced the string quartet, and couples swayed slowly beneath dim amber lighting while servers cleared away dinner plates covered in half-finished filet mignon and rosemary potatoes. Laughter drifted through the air in warm little bursts. From a distance, it looked like a perfect family celebration. That was what made the truth so difficult to recognize sometimes. Dysfunction rarely announces itself loudly in wealthy families. It hides beneath polished silverware and expensive smiles. Thomas came to my office about 8 months before he passed away, Arthur said carefully. He was very concerned about you. I frowned slightly. Concerned about my health? Arthur shook his head once. Concerned about your vulnerability. The words settled heavily inside me. Vulnerability. I had spent most of my life trying not to appear vulnerable to anyone. After Thomas died, I handled the funeral arrangements myself. I organized the estate paperwork without complaint. I continued hosting holiday dinners even when grief made the house feel unbearably quiet. But perhaps strength and vulnerability were not opposites after all. Perhaps the people who love hardest become vulnerable precisely because they continue giving long after others stop appreciating it. Arthur finally slid the envelope toward me across the table. Your husband established a family trust shortly before his death, he explained quietly. Most of the assets were placed under conditional distribution. I stared at him in confusion. Conditional? Arthur nodded. Thomas included. Behavioral clauses regarding access to certain funds. A soft laugh almost escaped me because the entire thing sounded absurdly formal coming from a man I once watched fall asleep in a lawn chair with barbecue sauce on his shirt during 4th of July cookouts. That sounds like something from a television drama, I murmured. Thomas always preferred preparation over regret, Arthur replied calmly. He had concerns about Melissa long before anyone else was willing to admit them. I looked instinctively across the ballroom toward her. Melissa stood near the dessert station speaking animatedly with 2 women wearing glittering evening gowns. Even now she looked flawless. Controlled. Admired. Ryan remained nearby carrying her purse while she talked. The image suddenly struck me with painful clarity. My son no longer looked like a husband or father. He looked like an assistant orbiting someone else's priorities. What exactly did Thomas do? I asked quietly. Arthur folded his hands carefully. The trust was designed to provide financial support for the family over time. However, Thomas included one very unusual provision. His eyes met mine steadily. Any heir shown to be exploiting, manipulating, or intentionally humiliating immediate family members could have their access permanently suspended. I felt my breath catch slightly. Humiliating? His word, not mine. Arthur's voice softened. Thomas believed character mattered more than bloodlines. For several moments I could not speak at all. Suddenly memories returned with startling sharpness. Thomas watching Melissa carefully during holiday dinners. Thomas insisting I maintain separate financial accounts after his death. Thomas quietly asking me once, only once, whether I truly felt respected inside my own family. At the time I dismissed the question because I did not want conflict. Now I wondered how much he had seen while I kept defending everyone around me. There is more. Arthur continued gently. The trust reviews family conduct periodically through legal oversight. Tonight's incident was not insignificant, Evelyn. My eyes lowered automatically toward the humiliating name tag still pinned against my dress. For the first time all evening, shame gave way to something else entirely. Clarity. You were saying Thomas expected something like this to happen. Arthur hesitated carefully before answering. I believe Thomas hoped he was wrong. Across the ballroom, Sophie suddenly approached our table looking flushed from dancing. Grandma, they are getting ready for the family photographs, she said brightly before noticing the tension between us. Everything okay? I forced a soft smile immediately. Of course, sweetheart. She glanced between Arthur and me uncertainly. Mom said they need everyone near the staircase. Arthur stood politely. I should let you enjoy the rest of the evening. Before leaving, he placed one hand lightly against the back of my chair and lowered his voice so only I could hear him. You have spent years protecting other people from consequences, Evelyn. His expression remained calm but unwavering. At some point, you must decide whether they have earned that protection. Then he walked away into the crowd. leaving me sitting there beneath the ballroom lights with my husband's final warning echoing quietly inside my chest. Sophie smiled nervously and held out her hand to help me stand. I looked at her beautiful young face and wondered whether she understood any of what was happening around her. Perhaps she truly did not. Or perhaps she had simply grown accustomed to the way Melissa treated me because no one had ever challenged it before. As we walked together toward the grand staircase for photographs, I noticed Melissa watching me from across the ballroom. Her smile never faltered. But for the first time that evening, I thought I detected something flicker behind it. Not guilt, not kindness, something colder. Calculation. The family photographs took nearly 40 minutes because Melissa wanted perfection in every frame. She adjusted flower arrangements herself, repositioned guests repeatedly, and corrected the photographer with the confidence of someone who believed the evening existed entirely for her approval. Ryan, straighten your jacket. Sophie, chin up a little. Evelyn, maybe hold your bouquet lower. Her voice floated across the grand staircase endlessly while guests smiled beneath the towering crystal chandelier above us. I stood exactly where she instructed, hands folded carefully around white roses tied with silk ribbon, while flashes from the camera burst against tired eyes and forced smiles. At one point, the photographer laughed lightly and said, "This family photographs beautifully." Melissa immediately answered before anyone else could speak. "That is because I spent a year organizing every detail." Ryan smiled weakly beside her. Sophie looked exhausted beneath layers of makeup and satin. I remained silent. The photographer eventually suggested a special picture with the woman who made the wedding possible. Several guests turned toward me politely, and for one brief second, I thought perhaps someone intended to show genuine appreciation. Instead, Melissa laughed and wrapped one arm around my shoulders dramatically. "Our family investor," she joked brightly. Several people chuckled automatically. Someone near the back muttered, "Best grandmother ever." I smiled for the photograph because by then I understood something important. Once people become comfortable disrespecting you publicly, they stop recognizing it as disrespect at all. It simply becomes part of the family dynamic. The ballroom lights felt harsher after midnight as the reception slowly began winding down. Elderly relatives left first, followed by families with children. Waiters cleared empty champagne glasses while hotel staff quietly folded in used chairs along the edges of the room. I told Sophie goodbye near the elevators, kissing her softly on the cheek while she held the train of her gown carefully in one hand. "Thank you for everything, Grandma," she whispered sincerely. Her eyes looked glassy with exhaustion and emotion. For a moment, I almost softened completely. Then Melissa appeared beside us carrying an expensive white leather handbag and interrupted before Sophie could say another word. "We need to get moving if we are going to make the after-party reservation." She glanced at me quickly. "Oh, and Evelyn, I left a few unpaid vendor invoices in your suite upstairs. Nothing urgent, but the hotel coordinator needs confirmation by tomorrow morning." I stared at her quietly. Even now, even tonight. Another bill, another assumption. Melissa mistook my silence for agreement and smiled brightly. "Perfect. I knew I could count on you." Then she turned away without waiting for a response. Ryan followed after her automatically like he always did. Sophie hesitated briefly before giving me one last tired hug. "I will call you tomorrow," she promised softly. I watched them disappear toward the private elevator reserved for the bridal party. Melissa walked ahead confidently in towering heels while hotel staff carried garment bags and gift boxes behind her. Ryan reached instinctively for the small of her back. Sophie trailed slightly behind them, looking overwhelmed and strangely small despite the glamorous gown. For the first time all evening, I noticed how lonely my granddaughter looked inside her own wedding. "You should not pay another dime," Grace said quietly beside me. I had not even noticed her approach. I exhaled slowly while staring toward the closed elevator doors. "I know." The words surprised me because they sounded certain. Final. We rode the hotel elevator together in silence up to the executive suites. The hallway smelled faintly of fresh linen and expensive perfume. Inside my suite, soft jazz still played from the television I had forgotten to turn off earlier in the evening. A silver tray waited on the dining table with untouched chocolate-covered strawberries and sparkling water. Beside it sat a stack of cream-colored envelopes held together by a gold ribbon. Vendor invoices. Of course. I removed my earrings slowly while staring at them from across the room. Then I noticed something else sitting underneath the paperwork. My checkbook. Melissa must have placed it there herself earlier while accessing the room with the extra key card I had given Ryan for emergencies months ago. The sight of that checkbook resting beneath unpaid bills hit me harder than the humiliating name tag ever had. Not because of the money itself. I could afford the invoices easily. But because the gesture revealed exactly how they saw me now. Not as a mother. Not as a grandmother. Not even as a grieving widow who spent years holding the family together after Thomas died. Just a resource. A convenient solution waiting quietly in the background. I crossed the room slowly and opened the top invoice. Additional ballroom extension charges. Midnight champagne service. Luxury transportation upgrades. Nearly $18,000 in unexpected expenses. I laughed softly then. Not because anything was funny. Because suddenly the entire evening made perfect sense. The jokes. The humiliation. The assumptions. People become careless with your dignity once they are convinced you will never stop giving. I closed the folder carefully and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the sleeping city below. Chicago glowed beneath the darkness in soft gold reflections across the lake. Somewhere downstairs my family continued celebrating. Somewhere inside that celebration, Melissa probably believed she had won completely. I slipped the checkbook into my purse without writing a single check. Then I picked up my phone and dialed Arthur Bennett's private number. He answered on the second ring. "Arthur," I said calmly while staring out across the city lights. "I think it is time we reviewed every detail of that trust." The next morning felt strangely peaceful. That surprised me more than anything else. After a night like that, I expected anger or heartbreak to settle heavily over me the way grief had after Thomas died. Instead, I woke before sunrise inside the quiet hotel suite feeling calm for the first time in years. Clear. The city outside my window still glowed faintly beneath the pale blue light of early morning, while Lake Michigan stretched silently beyond the skyline. I wrapped myself in the cream cashmere robe hanging near the bathroom door and made coffee using the small machine beside the minibar. Then I sat alone at the dining table staring at the stack of unpaid invoices Melissa had left behind for me, like a final task assigned to an employee before the end of a shift. I did not touch them. My phone buzzed around 8:30 with the first message from Ryan. "Morning, Mom. Melissa said the hotel coordinator might stop by regarding vendor balances. Can you handle that today?" No greeting. No mention of the humiliating name tag. No apology. Just another responsibility waiting for me to quietly absorb. I placed the phone face down beside my untouched coffee. 20 minutes later, another message appeared. The transportation company accidentally charged the wrong card for the airport transfers. Melissa is trying to sort it out. Call me when you wake up. I stared at the words for several seconds before setting the phone aside again. Something about his casual assumption no longer wounded me the way it once would have. Perhaps because I finally understood the truth completely now. People stop valuing sacrifices they never have to earn. At 10 o'clock, Arthur arrived at the suite carrying a leather portfolio and 2 cups of coffee from the cafe downstairs. He looked rested despite the late reception the night before. "You sound different this morning," he observed quietly after I opened the door. "Do I?" He studied me carefully for a moment. "You sound finished." The word lingered in the air between us while I moved toward the sitting area near the windows. Finished. Not broken. Not defeated. Simply finished accepting behavior I should have challenged years ago. Arthur opened the portfolio slowly across the dining table while morning light spilled across pages of legal documents and account summaries. "Thomas created stronger protections than you realize," he explained calmly. "Much stronger." I sat quietly listening while he reviewed trust agreements I barely remembered signing after my husband's death. Most of the estate remained under layered management structures designed specifically to prevent financial exploitation or coercion. Thomas had arranged everything carefully, methodically, as though he already suspected one day I might need protection from the very people claiming to love me. "Melissa has no direct access to the trust itself," Arthur continued. "But there are concerning patterns involving reimbursements, discretionary family expenses, and informal transfers approved through emotional pressure rather than legal authority." Emotional pressure. Such polite words for guilt, obligation, manipulation, wrapped inside family language. Arthur slid several highlighted account statements toward me. Wedding deposits, home renovation loans, Temporary financial assistance. Luxury travel expenses connected to Ryan and Melissa over the past 5 years. My stomach tightened as I read the totals. Not because the amounts threatened me financially, but because I finally saw the pattern clearly laid out on paper. They had built an entire lifestyle around the assumption that I would continue saying yes forever. Thomas documented concerns privately before his death, Arthur said gently. He worried Ryan confused kindness with entitlement. Hearing that nearly hurt more than the numbers themselves. My son had once been thoughtful, compassionate even, but somewhere over the years he stopped seeing generosity as a gift and started viewing it as infrastructure, like electricity or running water. Something simply expected to exist quietly in the background of his life. My phone rang suddenly across the table. Melissa. I let it ring 3 times before answering calmly. Good morning, Evelyn, she said brightly, though tension sat tightly beneath her cheerful tone now. Tiny issue. The hotel accounting office says the ballroom extension charges have not been finalized yet. I glanced at Arthur silently. I see. It is probably just a processing delay, she continued quickly. Could you call them? They are expecting payment authorization before noon because we reserved the rooftop lounge afterward too. Reserved. Of course they had. I imagined Melissa confidently adding upgrades throughout the evening, assuming I would handle everything afterward like always. I will review the invoices personally, I said quietly. A brief silence followed. Well, Melissa replied carefully. We really need this settled quickly because Sophie and Caleb leave for Santorini tomorrow morning. Not we. They. Her wording fascinated me suddenly. Every luxury, every expectation, every emergency somehow transformed into my responsibility through language alone. I looked down at the paperwork spread across the table while sunlight reflected softly against polished glass and silver. Melissa, I said, calmly, I am not authorizing any additional payments today. Silence. Complete silence. Then finally, I am sorry. Her voice sounded thinner now, less polished. I said no. The word came out gently. Steady. Final. Across from me, Arthur lowered his eyes slightly, almost hiding a faint smile. Melissa recovered quickly, but I could hear panic beginning to creep beneath her carefully controlled tone. Evelyn, there must be some misunderstanding. These balances were always part of the wedding budget. I folded one invoice neatly closed. No, I replied softly while staring out at the bright Chicago skyline beyond the windows. The misunderstanding lasted much longer than the wedding. Melissa arrived at my suite less than 40 minutes later wearing oversized sunglasses despite the cloudy morning outside. Ryan followed behind her carrying 2 garment bags and looking visibly exhausted, as though he had barely slept after the reception. The moment I opened the hotel room door, I could feel tension radiating from both of them. Melissa removed her sunglasses immediately and forced a tight smile. Evelyn, we really need to clear up this confusion before checkout. Confusion. Another elegant word hiding something uglier underneath. I stepped aside quietly to let them enter. Arthur remained seated near the dining table reviewing documents with calm precision while the morning news murmured softly from the television in the background. The sight of him clearly unsettled Melissa. Her posture stiffened almost instantly. Arthur, she said carefully. I did not realize this was a legal meeting. Arthur closed the folder in front of him without standing. That depends entirely on how today unfolds. Ryan rubbed one hand over his face tiredly. Mom, what is going on? Melissa said you suddenly refused to cover the remaining balances. Suddenly, as though years of financial dependence had been interrupted without warning instead of built slowly through expectation and entitlement. I motioned calmly toward the invoices spread across the table. Sit down, Ryan. My son obeyed automatically, though confusion clouded his expression now. Melissa remained standing. The hotel needs confirmation within the hour, she said sharply. The honeymoon flights are connected to the wedding package discounts, and if the invoices are not finalized, Melissa, I interrupted quietly. Please stop speaking to me like an unpaid assistant. Silence settled instantly across the room. Ryan looked stunned. Melissa blinked once as though she genuinely did not recognize the behavior I was describing. That realization disturbed me more than anger would have. She had become so comfortable using me that she no longer saw anything inappropriate about it. I think emotions are running high after the wedding. Melissa replied finally with controlled politeness. But none of this changes the fact that these expenses were expected. Arthur folded his hands together calmly. Actually, that assumption is precisely what concerns us. Melissa's eyes narrowed slightly. Us. Arthur slid several papers across the table toward Ryan. Your father established very specific protections regarding family assets before his death. Ryan frowned while scanning the first page. What is this? A trust review, Arthur answered. One triggered by repeated patterns of financial exploitation and public humiliation directed toward Mrs. Carter. Ryan looked up immediately. Exploitation. His voice sounded almost offended by the word. Melissa crossed her arms tightly. This is ridiculous. I remained seated quietly beside the window while rain began tapping softly against the glass outside. Chicago looked gray and distant beneath the storm clouds gathering over the lake. Is it? I asked gently. Because last night you publicly mocked me at your daughter's wedding while simultaneously leaving nearly $20,000 of unpaid expenses in my hotel suite. Melissa laughed once in disbelief. It was a joke. No, I replied softly. It was honesty disguised as humor. Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mom, come on. Nobody was trying to humiliate you. I looked directly at my son then. Truly looked at him. The exhaustion beneath his eyes. The nervousness tightening his shoulders. The reflexive instinct to protect Melissa before understanding the situation fully. Somewhere over the years, my kind-hearted little boy had slowly become a man more afraid of disappointing his wife than hurting his own mother. Did you see the name tag before the reception? I asked quietly. Ryan hesitated. That hesitation answered everything. Ryan, my voice remained calm. Did you know? He lowered his eyes toward the paperwork. Melissa thought it would be funny. Funny. Such a small word for such an ugly moment. I nodded slowly, more saddened than angry now. And you allowed it. Melissa stepped forward immediately. Oh please, Evelyn. You are acting like we committed some terrible crime because of one harmless joke. Arthur finally spoke again, his voice smooth and precise. Actually, Mrs. Carter's treatment last night may affect future trust distributions substantially. The room went completely still. Melissa turned sharply toward him. What does that mean? Arthur opened another folder carefully. It means Thomas Carter documented explicit conditions regarding inheritance access. Conditions involving dignity, coercion, and manipulative financial behavior within the family structure. Melissa's face lost color gradually. Ryan stared down at the paperwork as though reading a language he no longer understood. Dad did this, he whispered. Your father loved your mother very much, Arthur replied quietly. Enough to recognize what she might someday need protection from. Rain streaked steadily across the windows now, while thunder rolled faintly over the distant lake. The luxurious hotel suite suddenly felt smaller somehow. Tighter. Melissa recovered first, straightening her posture carefully. So this is blackmail now? She asked coldly. I almost smiled at the irony. No, Melissa, I said softly while folding the final unpaid invoice neatly closed in front of me. This is simply the first time your actions have consequences. Across the room, Ryan finally looked at me directly, and for the first time in years, I saw something painful flicker across his face. Not annoyance. Not obligation. Shame. 3 months after the wedding, my house finally felt peaceful again. Not lively. Not full. Peaceful. There is a difference. The old grandfather clock in the hallway sounded louder now without constant phone calls, financial emergencies, or last-minute requests interrupting every quiet moment of my day. Some mornings I sat alone on the back porch with coffee while autumn leaves drifted slowly across the yard Thomas and I planted together nearly 30 years earlier. The silence no longer felt lonely. It felt earned. Arthur handled everything with remarkable efficiency after the confrontation at the hotel. Access to several discretionary trust distributions was temporarily suspended pending formal review. Additional financial oversight was established immediately. Melissa was furious, of course. According to Grace, she spent weeks calling relatives trying to portray herself as the victim of some cruel misunderstanding. But wealthy social circles are strange places. Public humiliation travels quickly, especially when paired with legal documents and unpaid luxury invoices. Within a month, people who once admired Melissa's polished perfection began keeping their distance politely. Invitations slowed. Conversations shortened. Sympathy faded once facts replaced appearances. Ryan called often during those first few weeks. At first, he sounded defensive, frustrated. Mom, this has gone too far. Melissa feels attacked. You embarrassed us. But slowly his tone began changing. I think reality finally became difficult to ignore once he reviewed the financial records himself. There were more withdrawals than he realized. More assumptions. More manipulation disguised as family necessity. One evening, he arrived unexpectedly at my front door, carrying a paper bag from my favorite Italian bakery downtown. For several seconds, we simply stood there looking at one another beneath the porch light like strangers, trying to remember an old language. Can I come in? He asked quietly. I nodded and led him into the kitchen. He looked older somehow, sitting at the same oak table where he used to do homework as a little boy. Tired around the eyes. Smaller in spirit. I should have stopped it, he admitted eventually, while staring down at untouched cannoli boxes between us. The jokes. The comments. Everything. I said nothing. Sometimes. Silence forces honesty more effectively than anger ever can. Ryan rubbed both hands together slowly. I kept telling myself Melissa did not mean anything by it. That it was easier not to argue. His voice cracked slightly then. I did not realize how much that was costing you. Costing. Interesting word. Not hurting. Not damaging. Costing. As though emotional neglect operated like quiet debt accumulating over time until suddenly the balance became impossible to ignore. You were my son before you were her husband, I said softly. Somewhere along the way, you forgot that. Tears filled his eyes immediately, though he tried hard to hide them. Seeing my grown son cry should have shattered me. Instead, I only felt sad. Sad for the boy he once was. Sad for the years we lost pretending everything was normal. Melissa never came to the house herself. Not once. She sent long text messages at first, then carefully worded emails accusing me of overreacting. Later, the messages shifted into apologies that somehow still blamed everyone except her. Eventually, they stopped altogether. Grace told me Melissa and Ryan were attending marriage counseling now. Apparently, Sophie encouraged it after witnessing the hotel confrontation. Sophie. Sweet Sophie surprised me most of all. About 6 weeks after the wedding, she appeared at my front door alone wearing jeans, sneakers, and no makeup at all. She looked younger without all the wedding glamour surrounding her. More honest somehow. Can we talk? She asked quietly. We spent nearly 4 hours together that afternoon drinking tea in the sunroom while rain tapped softly against the windows. Sophie cried at one point while admitting she had spent years noticing uncomfortable things but convincing herself they were harmless because no one else ever challenged them. Mom always said you liked taking care of everyone, she whispered. I did, I replied gently. But love offered freely should still be treated with respect. She nodded slowly like someone finally understanding a lesson long overdue. After that day, Sophie began visiting every Sunday again. Not out of obligation. Not for money. Simply because she wanted to. We cooked together. Sometimes. Other afternoons, we worked quietly in the garden trimming roses while sharing stories about Thomas. The relationship felt fragile at first, like rebuilding something damaged by years of neglect. But real things heal slowly. That is how you know they matter. Last week, while cleaning an old handbag in my bedroom closet, I found the wedding name tag folded carefully inside a side pocket. The cream paper had softened slightly at the edges from being carried around for months. I stared at the gold lettering for a very long time. Then I walked downstairs, opened the fireplace, and dropped it gently into the flames. The paper curled black almost immediately before disappearing completely. I stood there watching the fire quietly while evening shadows stretched across the living room Thomas once filled with laughter and music and warmth. They thought I was simply an old woman paying for everything. But they forgot something important. I was the one holding the entire family together. And the moment I stopped carrying them, everything they built on my silence finally began to collapse.